I lost my place forever. I never imagined that a dinner meant to celebrate my son's wedding anniversary would become the moment I finally understood where I stood in my own family. For weeks, I had looked forward to that evening. Brian had called me himself, his warm voice almost reminding me of the little boy who used to run into my arms after school. "Mom, we'd really love for you to come," he had said. "Madison's planning something nice." Those words stayed with me longer than they probably should have. After my husband, Charles, passed away 3 years earlier, invitations had become less frequent. Holidays always seemed to have scheduling conflicts. Birthdays were suddenly celebrated with friends before family. Somehow there was always a reason why I arrived after the important moments had already happened. Still, I refused to believe any of it was intentional. Families go through seasons, I told myself. Things would get better if I stayed patient. That afternoon I stood in my kitchen carefully wrapping a homemade apple pie, using the same recipe Charles's mother had taught me more than 40 years ago. The smell of cinnamon filled my little house, bringing back memories of Thanksgiving mornings when Brian would sneak slices before dinner. I smiled without realizing it. Beside the pie rested a cream-colored envelope. Inside was a cashier's check for $25,000. Brian had mentioned a few months earlier that the roof needed replacing before winter storms arrived. He never asked me for money. He didn't have to. Charles and I had always believed that if family needed help and we were able to provide it, we should. I slipped the envelope into my handbag and drove the 22 miles to Brian's neighborhood just before sunset. The houses there were larger than anything Charles and I had ever owned, with perfectly trimmed lawns and wide front porches decorated with hanging flower baskets. Brian's home still made me proud every time I saw it. I remembered helping him paint his first apartment decades ago with borrowed brushes and discount paint. Watching him build a successful life had always felt like my greatest accomplishment. Madison greeted me at the front door, wearing an elegant cream-colored dress and a smile that looked carefully practiced. "Eleanor," she said brightly. "You made it." She kissed the air beside my cheek without actually touching me. Behind her, I heard laughter floating from the dining room. Crystal glasses clinked together. Someone uncorked another bottle of sparkling cider. The entire house smelled of roasted herbs and fresh bread. I stepped inside carrying my pie with both hands. "I hope everyone likes dessert," I said. "It's Brian's favorite. Just leave it in the kitchen," Madison replied quickly before taking the pie from my hands. "We're trying to keep the dining room looking perfect." I nodded and quietly removed my coat. As I walked toward the dining room, I noticed framed family photographs covering the hallway wall. Vacation pictures, Christmas mornings, birthday parties. My grandchildren smiled from nearly every frame. I studied them for a second longer than I should have. In many of the newer pictures, I wasn't there. Maybe I had been busy. Maybe I had simply missed those days. I kept telling myself not to overthink it. Then I reached the dining room doorway. My footsteps stopped before I realized I had stopped walking. The chair where I had sat at every family dinner for over 15 years had been transformed. A soft embroidered cushion covered the seat. A polished silver water bowl rested beside the dinner plate. A tiny folded napkin embroidered with the name Bentley sat neatly beside a porcelain dish shaped like a bone. Their white poodle wagged his tail proudly from my chair while several guests chuckled at how adorable he looked. Before I could speak, Madison glanced toward me with effortless calm and smiled. "Oh, Eleanor," she said sweetly, pointing toward a folding stool tucked beside the kitchen entrance. "Would you mind sitting over there instead? Bentley gets anxious unless he sits with family." For a moment, I simply stood there, my fingers still wrapped around the strap of my handbag. No one laughed loudly. No one protested either. The silence around the table settled over the room like a heavy winter blanket, making every second feel much longer than it really was. Bentley happily wagged his tail, completely unaware of what was happening. It was not the little dog who had embarrassed me. It was the people sitting around him. Madison tilted her head with that same pleasant smile. "It is only for tonight," she said gently. "He gets nervous around guests." I slowly looked around the table. There were 8 upholstered dining chairs. Every single one was occupied by family or friends except mine. The folding stool near the kitchen was the kind people used when there were too many guests during holiday dinners. It had no cushion, no back support, and barely enough room to fit beneath the corner of the table. It was close enough for me to hear every conversation, yet far enough away to remind everyone that I did not truly belong. I turned toward Brian, waiting for him to notice what his wife had done. Surely he would smile awkwardly and say, "Mom, take my chair." That was what the son I raised would have done, without hesitation. Instead, he reached for his glass and took a slow sip. His eyes met mine for only a second before drifting toward Madison. "Mom," he finally said in a calm voice, "it is really not a big deal. We are all just trying to have a relaxing evening." His words landed much harder than I expected, not because they were cruel, but because they were so casual. As though my dignity had become an inconvenience. I forced a small smile. "Of course," I replied quietly. "I would not want to ruin dinner." Madison thanked me as if I had done something generous. "I knew you would understand." I walked to the folding stool without another word and carefully lowered myself onto it. The metal legs creaked beneath me. My knees immediately reminded me that I was no longer 30 years old. Across the table, Bentley rested comfortably on the soft embroidered cushion that had once belonged to my husband. I recognized it instantly. Years ago, Charles had bought those matching chair cushions for our 50th wedding anniversary dinner because he wanted everyone to be comfortable during long family meals. After he passed away, Brian had asked whether he could have them since they reminded him of family gatherings. I had happily given them to him, believing they would continue to hold happy memories. I never imagined one would eventually support a dog while I balanced myself on a folding stool. Dinner began as though nothing unusual had happened. Plates of roasted chicken, mashed potatoes, green beans, and warm dinner rolls were passed around the table. Everyone complimented Madison on the decorations. Someone joked about football season. Another guest talked about vacation plans in Colorado. I listened politely, smiling whenever someone happened to glance my way. Every few minutes, Bentley received another piece of chicken from Madison's plate. "He deserves a treat," she laughed. "He has been such a good boy tonight." Several guests smiled. One woman reached over to scratch behind his ears. "He is definitely part of the family," she said warmly. The words echoed inside my head longer than they should have. Part of the family. I quietly picked up my fork and looked down at my untouched plate. Suddenly, memories I had spent years ignoring began arranging themselves into a picture I could no longer dismiss. The Christmas dinner where my seat had mysteriously disappeared because of extra guests. The family beach photo where Madison insisted I stand off to one side because the lighting looked better. The birthday party where I spent 2 hours serving food in the kitchen while everyone else laughed together on the patio. I had always accepted every explanation because I wanted peace more than pride. I told myself families were imperfect. I convinced myself that love required patience. Sitting there on that uncomfortable stool, watching my own son smile while everyone admired the dog occupying my place, I realized something painful. Those moments had never been accidents. They had been quiet lessons, teaching me exactly where they believed I belonged. I barely tasted the food on my plate. The roasted chicken was perfectly seasoned. The mashed potatoes were smooth and buttery. The fresh rolls were still warm from the oven. Under different circumstances, I would have complimented Madison, thanked her for the wonderful meal, and offered to help wash the dishes afterward. That had always been my place in this family. I believed kindness was something you practiced, even when no one noticed. But that evening, every bite felt heavier than the last. I found myself studying faces instead of food. Brian laughed at one of his coworkers' stories with the same carefree smile he used to wear as a teenager. Madison poured sparkling cider into everyone's glasses before carefully refreshing Bentley's water bowl. She apologized immediately when she noticed it was only half full. "I never want him to feel ignored," she said softly, while gently scratching behind his ears. Everyone smiled at the little display of affection. No one seemed to notice that my own glass had been empty for several minutes. I quietly reached for the pitcher myself. As I did, I accidentally brushed against the corner of the folding stool. It shifted slightly beneath me, forcing me to steady myself against the table. Madison looked over with polite concern. Are you all right, Eleanor? She asked. Those folding stools are not very comfortable, are they? I smiled gently.
No, Ian suara.
They are not. She nodded sympathetically before returning her attention to the conversation as though nothing important had just been said. That simple exchange settled something inside me. She knew exactly what she was doing. The discomfort was never accidental. It was part of the message. As dessert approached, Madison disappeared into the kitchen and returned carrying the apple pie I had baked that afternoon. My heart lifted for just a moment. Perhaps she would mention that I had made it. Perhaps she would let Brian remember how much he had always loved this recipe. Instead, she placed it in the center of a table and smiled proudly. I am so glad we have homemade dessert tonight, she said. It really completes the evening. She never mentioned my name. One of the guests complimented the beautiful crust. Another asked Madison how long it had taken her to make it. She accepted the praise with an easy smile and simply replied, it was worth the effort. I lowered my eyes toward my plate. I could have corrected them. I could have said that I had been awake before sunrise peeling apples and mixing dough by hand. I could have reminded Brian that this was the pie he requested every birthday growing up. But I remained silent. Not because I was weak. Because I wanted to see how far this evening would go without anyone choosing to do the right thing on their own. Brian took a second slice and smiled. This tastes just like the pies Dad used to love. His words lingered in the room for a brief second before disappearing into another conversation. He still did not realize who had baked it. Or perhaps he realized and decided it did not matter enough to mention. Both possibilities hurt equally. Then I heard something that changed the way I looked at the entire evening. Madison leaned toward one of her closest friends, believing the laughter around the table would cover her voice. I think she is finally getting used to it, she whispered with a satisfied smile. She used to expect everything to revolve around her. Now she knows things have changed. Her friend glanced toward me before quietly nodding. It is probably better this way, she replied. Every family has to move forward eventually. I looked down at my folded hands resting in my lap. There was no anger rushing through me.
No dramatic heartbreak.
Only a strange calm that arrived after years of explaining away moments that should never have required explanations. I finally understood that tonight had not been about a chair, a meal, or even a family celebration. It had been carefully designed to teach me that my place had already been reassigned long before I walked through that front door. The only person who had not understood that until now had been me. The laughter around the table continued as though nothing unusual had happened, but I had already drifted somewhere else. Sometimes the mind protects the heart by opening old doors at exactly the moment reality becomes too painful. I found myself remembering another dinner many years earlier, long before Madison entered our lives. Brian had been 12 years old, all elbows and freckles, sitting across from his father with mashed potatoes smeared across his cheek because he had been laughing too hard at one of Charles's terrible jokes. Charles had looked around the table, raised his glass of iced tea, and smiled at me. A family is not measured by the size of the house, he had said. It is measured by whether everyone has a place at the table. At the time it had sounded like one of his many simple observations. I never imagined those words would become the standard by which I would one day measure the people we loved most. Charles always insisted that every guest deserved the best seat we had. During holidays, he often gave up his own chair for elderly neighbors or unexpected visitors. Comfort is one way people know they matter, he used to tell Brian. Our son had watched those quiet acts of kindness for years. He helped carry extra chairs from the garage. He learned to refill glasses before anyone had to ask. He was the little boy who once stood for an entire Thanksgiving dinner because he wanted his grandmother to have the most comfortable chair. I remembered looking at him that afternoon with pride so overwhelming that it nearly brought tears to my eyes. Charles had leaned close and whispered, "He is becoming a good man." I believed him with all my heart. Life changed after Charles became ill. The hospital visits grew longer. The medications multiplied across our kitchen counter. Brian visited often during those difficult months, sitting beside his father for hours, promising that he would always look after me no matter what happened. I never asked him to make that promise. He offered it freely. On Charles's final evening at home, He squeezed Brian's shoulder and quietly said, "Take care of your mother. She spent her whole life taking care of us." Brian nodded without hesitation. His eyes were full of tears. I believed promises made beside a loved one's final bed carried a special kind of weight. Perhaps that was my mistake. After the funeral, everything shifted so gradually that I hardly noticed. Sunday dinners became monthly dinners. Monthly dinners became holiday visits. Phone calls grew shorter. Madison always seemed to have another commitment, another schedule, another reason why gathering together had become difficult. Whenever I suggested hosting dinner at my house, she would smile politely and explain that the children preferred staying home. I accepted every explanation because I never wanted Brian to feel caught between his wife and his mother. Peace seemed more valuable than pride. Looking back now, I could see how carefully each small change had moved me farther from the center of their lives. First, I stopped receiving keys to their house because they had installed a new security system. Then, family vacations were planned before anyone remembered to invite me. Birthdays became casual text messages instead of shared meals. None of those moments seemed important by themselves. Together, they formed a map leading exactly to the folding stool where I now sat. I slipped my hand inside my handbag and felt the smooth edge of the cream-colored envelope. $25,000 rested inside, intended to replace Brian's aging roof before another snowy winter arrived. Charles and I had saved carefully for decades. We skipped expensive vacations. We drove the same sedan for nearly 12 years. Every dollar represented patience, sacrifice, and hope that our family would always stand together. I had carried that envelope into the house believing I was bringing another gift born from love. Now, it suddenly felt much heavier than paper should. Across the room, Brian laughed again while Madison rested her hand gently on his arm. They looked happy, successful, comfortable. Watching them, I realized something I had refused to admit for far too long. They no longer saw me as the woman who had helped build the foundation beneath their lives. They saw me as someone expected to keep giving quietly while asking for nothing in return. And for years, I had made that expectation seem perfectly reasonable. I quietly closed my handbag and rested it beside my feet. No one noticed. They were too busy discussing summer travel plans, home renovations, and school activities for the children. The conversations flowed around me like I was sitting behind invisible glass. It was a strange feeling. I had spent decades believing that silence meant peace. That evening I discovered silence could also reveal the truth. Then a small voice broke through the chatter. "Grandma, why are you sitting over there?" I looked up to see my 9-year-old granddaughter, Lily, watching me with honest confusion. Unlike the adults, children had not yet learned how to pretend uncomfortable things were normal. Madison smiled before I could answer. "Bentley needed the comfortable chair tonight, sweetheart." Lily frowned. "But that has always been Grandma's chair." The room grew noticeably quieter. A few guests suddenly became very interested in their dessert plates. Brian cleared his throat and reached for his drink. Madison laughed softly, as though the question were adorable. "Sometimes we have to make little changes," she replied. Lily looked from the dog to me and then back again. Could Bentley not sit on the floor for one dinner? No one answered immediately. Bentley happily chewed on a small toy without paying attention to the conversation unfolding around him. I could see Lily trying to understand something that simply did not make sense in her young mind. She was not asking about furniture. She was asking why kindness had suddenly disappeared. Madison reached over and gently touched Lily's shoulder. "Sweetheart, please eat your pie." Lily did not move. Instead, she looked directly at me. "Grandma, are you sad?" Children ask questions adults spend years avoiding. I smiled as warmly as I could.
No, suar, ian suarat sufli.
Sometimes people simply show us things we were not ready to see before. She seemed puzzled by my answer, but she quietly nodded. Across the table, Brian finally spoke. "Mom, Lily does not understand. Let us not make this into something bigger than it is." I met my son's eyes for the first time that evening without looking away. "You are right," I said calmly. "She does not understand. That is probably a good thing." My voice remained gentle, but something inside me had changed forever. I realized I no longer wanted explanations. I no longer wanted apologies offered only after someone else noticed the problem. Those things would never restore what had already been lost. Respect that has to be requested is not respect at all. It is obligation. I slowly reached into my handbag once more and touched the cream-colored envelope. My fingers rested on it for several seconds before I carefully withdrew my hand without removing it. Earlier that afternoon, I had imagined handing it to Brian after dessert. I could almost hear myself saying, "Your father would have wanted to help with the new roof." Now those words belonged to another version of me, a woman who still believed generosity naturally inspired gratitude. I looked around the dining room one final time. The polished hardwood floor reflected the warm light from the chandelier Charles had once helped Brian install. The china cabinet displayed family photographs collected over many years. Every object in that room told the story of people who had once depended on one another. Yet somehow the values that built those memories had quietly disappeared while the decorations remained exactly the same. Lily stood from her chair carrying her small dessert plate. Without saying a word, she walked across the room and placed it carefully on the little folding stool beside me. Then she climbed onto my lap, wrapped her arms around my shoulders, and whispered, "I think this is still your place." My eyes filled with tears that I refused to let fall. I gently kissed the top of her head and held her close. In that simple moment, surrounded by adults who had chosen convenience over compassion, the youngest person in the room reminded me what family was supposed to look like. And for the first time all evening, I realized I was not leaving that house empty-handed. I gently helped Lily back into her own chair before she could become the center of an argument she never intended to start. She looked disappointed, but she squeezed my hand one last time before returning to her place. That small gesture stayed with me far more than anything the adults had said all evening. It reminded me that kindness still existed. It had simply become quieter than selfishness. Madison stood and began collecting empty plates with practiced efficiency. "Everyone stay seated," she said cheerfully. "Brian and I will take care of everything." Years ago, I would have stood immediately, carried dishes into the kitchen, washed every pan, and stayed behind until the countertop sparkled. It had never felt like a burden. It was one of the ways I showed love. This time I remained exactly where I was. Madison glanced toward me for a brief second. I could almost see the surprise in her eyes. She had expected me to follow the old routine without being asked. When I did not move, she simply smiled again and continued stacking plates. Brian noticed the silence between us, but chose not to acknowledge it. Instead, he began talking with his friends about replacing the roof before the first snowfall. "The estimate came back higher than I expected," he said with a frustrated laugh. "Everything costs more these days." I listened quietly. Every word reminded me of the envelope resting inside my handbag. $25,000. Enough to solve the problem they were discussing so casually. Enough to remove months of financial pressure. Earlier that afternoon, I had imagined Brian's face lighting up with gratitude when I handed it to him. Now I wondered why I had assumed gratitude would naturally follow generosity. Madison returned from the kitchen carrying a fresh pot of coffee. She filled everyone's cup before stopping beside me. "Would you like some?" she asked politely. "No, thank you," I replied. "I think I will be leaving soon." Brian looked surprised. "Already? We have barely finished dessert." I smiled gently. "It has been a long evening." He nodded without asking another question. That hurt almost as much as everything else. There had been a time when he would have walked me to my car, carried leftovers for me, and reminded me to call when I arrived home safely. Tonight, he simply accepted my departure as another item on the schedule. I slowly stood from the folding stool, carefully straightening my jacket. My knees ached after sitting on the hard metal seat, but I refused to let anyone see my discomfort. I picked up my handbag and looked around the room one final time. Every conversation had already resumed. Laughter filled the house once again. It was remarkable how quickly people returned to normal after deciding someone else's feelings were no longer important. Before reaching the front door, I paused beside the hallway table where I had planned to leave the cream-colored envelope. My hand slipped inside my handbag and rested on it for a moment. Then I quietly closed the zipper. The envelope remained exactly where it belonged. Madison noticed the movement from across the room. "Was there something you needed?" she asked with polite curiosity. I looked at her and smiled, not with bitterness, but with complete clarity.
No, he answered calmly.
I realized I almost left something behind that still belongs to me. She seemed slightly confused, but quickly recovered. "Drive safely, Eleanor." "I always do," I replied. Brian finally walked over and gave me a brief hug. It felt rushed, almost automatic, like another task waiting to be checked off before the evening ended. "Thanks for coming, Mom," he said. "We should do this again soon." I looked into his eyes and searched for the little boy who once believed every guest deserved the best chair in the house. I could still see traces of him buried beneath years of compromise and convenience, but he no longer seemed to be making the decisions. "Perhaps," I answered softly. "But next time, make sure everyone knows where they truly belong before dinner begins." He frowned slightly, as though he sensed there was more behind my words than he understood. I stepped outside into the cool evening air, closed the front door gently behind me, and walked toward my car without looking back. For the first time in years, I did not feel rejected. I felt awake. Some evenings change nothing. Others quietly divide your life into everything that happened before and everything you choose afterward. As I started the engine, I rested one hand on my handbag and realized that the most valuable thing I carried home that night was not the cashier's check. It was the certainty that my future would no longer be built on silent acceptance. I did not sleep much that night. The house felt unusually quiet, yet it was not the kind of silence that comes with loneliness. It was the silence that follows a difficult truth finally being spoken, even if no words had actually been said. I placed my handbag on the kitchen table and slowly removed the cream-colored envelope. It remained perfectly sealed, just as it had been when I left home earlier that afternoon. I stared at it for several minutes before placing it back inside the desk drawer where Charles and I had always kept important family papers. Beside it rested a thick blue folder that I had not opened in years. Curious, I pulled it onto the table and gently brushed away a thin layer of dust. Inside were documents Charles had insisted we organize shortly after his retirement. Property records, savings accounts, insurance policies, trust agreements. Every page reflected decades of careful planning. Charles used to say that financial peace was another way parents protected their children. As I slowly turned each page, I realized there were details I had almost forgotten. Although Brian and Madison lived in the house, the property itself had never been transferred into their names. Charles had purchased it years earlier as an investment, allowing Brian to live there while building his career. After Charles passed away, ownership transferred entirely to me. Brian paid only a small monthly amount that barely covered taxes and maintenance because we wanted him to have the opportunity to save for his own future. I sat back in my chair, surprised that I had allowed myself to forget something so significant. Perhaps I had never needed to remember it before. Trust has a strange way of making paperwork seem unimportant. My telephone rang just after 9 o'clock the following morning. Brian's name appeared on the screen. I let it ring twice before answering. "Good morning," I said calmly. "Morning, Mom," he replied. His voice sounded cheerful, almost casual. "I just wanted to thank you again for coming last night. Lily keeps talking about how happy she was to see you." I smiled faintly. "She is a wonderful little girl." There was a brief pause before he continued. "By the way, I forgot to ask. You mentioned a few weeks ago that you had something important you wanted to bring over. Did you forget it?" I looked toward the closed desk drawer across the room.
No, he answered truthfully.
I decided it was not the right time. Another silence followed. "Oh," Brian finally said. "Well, maybe next time." "Perhaps," I replied gently. "We will see." Neither of us mentioned the dinner. Neither of us mentioned the folding stool. Neither of us mentioned the chair. Sometimes the things left unsaid reveal more than the conversations themselves. After we ended the call, I made myself a cup of tea and carried it onto the back porch. The early morning breeze moved gently through the maple trees Charles had planted almost 30 years earlier. Watching the leaves sway, I remembered something he once told me while we worked in the garden. People usually show you who they are long before you believe them, he had said. Love should make us patient, Eleanor, but it should never make us blind. I had laughed at the time, teasing him for sounding like an old philosopher. Now those words returned with remarkable clarity. My patience had never been the problem. My unwillingness to see the pattern had been. Around noon, my attorney, Daniel Foster, returned a voicemail I had left several days earlier regarding routine estate planning. We exchanged greetings before he asked whether I still wanted to review everything after the anniversary season had passed. I looked once more toward the blue folder resting on my kitchen table. Actually, Daniel, I said in a calm, steady voice, I think I would like to move our meeting up. There are a few decisions I have postponed for far too long, and I believe I am finally ready to make them. I met Daniel Foster 2 days later in the same small law office where Charles and I had signed our wills nearly 15 years earlier. Very little had changed. The framed photographs still hung neatly on the walls. The receptionist still greeted clients with the same warm smile. Even the old grandfather clock in the corner continued marking each passing minute with quiet certainty. Daniel stood as I entered his office and shook my hand with genuine kindness. It is good to see you, Eleanor, he said. I wish it were under less stressful circumstances. I smiled politely. Stress has a way of helping people see clearly. He studied my face for a moment before nodding. You sound different today. I am, I replied. We spent nearly an hour reviewing every document Charles and I had prepared over the years. Daniel explained each page carefully, although I already understood most of them. What surprised me was not the paperwork itself, but how much authority I still held. The house where Brian and Madison lived remained entirely under my ownership. The educational trust Charles had established for Lily listed me as the sole trustee, with complete discretion over future distributions. Several investment accounts also remained under my direct control until I decided otherwise. None of those arrangements had ever been intended as leverage. They had simply reflected Charles's belief that thoughtful planning protected the family from unnecessary hardship. Daniel folded his hands together after closing the final folder. May I ask what prompted this review? He said gently. I looked out the office window toward the quiet street below. For a long time, I confused generosity with responsibility, I answered. I believed that if I continued giving enough, respect would naturally follow. Now I understand those are two very different things. Daniel nodded thoughtfully, without interrupting. I do not want revenge, I continued. I only want my decisions to reflect reality instead of wishful thinking. He smiled faintly. That is usually when people make their wisest choices. Together we updated several documents. I postponed the financial gift I had intended for Brian's home repairs. Instead, those funds would remain invested until I decided they were truly needed. We also added additional educational provisions that protected Lily's future regardless of circumstances beyond her control. When everything had been signed, Daniel handed me a neatly organized folder. Nothing you have done today punishes anyone, he said. You have simply chosen to manage your own resources with greater care. His words stayed with me during the drive home. Punishment had never interested me. Clarity had. 3 mornings later, my telephone rang again. This time it was Madison. She rarely called me directly unless she needed a recipe or wanted to coordinate a holiday schedule. Hello, Eleanor, she began pleasantly. Brian mentioned you were planning something important before the anniversary dinner. We realized afterward that maybe we rushed you out before you had a chance to share it. I almost smiled. That is thoughtful of you. We were actually wondering if you would like to come over this weekend, she continued. The children would love to see you again. I noticed she mentioned the children before mentioning Brian or herself. It was a careful choice of words. That is kind of you, I replied. But I already have plans. Oh. Her cheerful tone faltered slightly. Maybe next weekend? I looked through my kitchen window toward the small vegetable garden Charles and I had planted together years ago. Tomatoes ripened peacefully beneath the morning sun. Nothing in that garden ever rushed its season. I think it would be better if we waited a little while, I answered gently. Sometimes people need time to reflect. Another silence followed. Is everything all right? Madison finally asked. Everything is becoming much clearer, I said calmly. That is more than all right. After we ended the call, I returned to watering the garden without the slightest feeling of anger. For the first time in years, I was making decisions without fear of disappointing anyone. The strange thing about self-respect is that it does not arrive with loud speeches or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it quietly appears the moment you stop offering pieces of yourself to people who have already shown you they no longer recognize their value. Nearly 3 weeks passed before I saw Brian again. He called one Saturday morning and asked whether he could stop by for a few minutes. His voice sounded different from our recent conversations. Less certain, less hurried. I told him he was welcome anytime. When he arrived, he stood on my front porch holding a small basket of fresh peaches from a local farmer's market. It reminded me of the days when he was young and never visited empty-handed because Charles had taught him that gratitude should always travel with you. "These looked good," he said awkwardly as I welcomed him inside. "I remembered you liked peaches." I smiled and placed the basket on the kitchen counter. "Thank you." We sat at the same oak table where I had reviewed all those documents only days earlier. For several minutes we talked about ordinary things. The weather, Lily's school, the vegetable garden. Finally, Brian rested his hands on the table and looked directly at me. "Mom, I need to ask you something." I nodded quietly. "Go ahead." He took a slow breath. "Have I done something that hurt you?" The question lingered between us. Months earlier, I probably would have rushed to reassure him that everything was fine. I would have protected him from the discomfort of hearing an honest answer. This time I chose differently. "Yes," I replied gently. He lowered his eyes. "Was it that dinner?" I did not answer immediately. Instead, I poured each of us a cup of tea before returning to my chair. "The dinner was not the beginning," I said softly. "It was simply the first time I stopped making excuses for what had already been happening for years." Brian remained silent. "Do you remember something your father used to say?" I asked. He frowned thoughtfully. "He said many things." I smiled faintly. "He always believed everyone deserved a place at the table." Brian's expression slowly changed. I watched recognition settle across his face, one painful piece at a time. He remembered. Not just that evening, but countless family dinners before it. The lessons, the examples, the values he had once carried so naturally. "I should have said something," he whispered. "Yes," I answered. "You should have." Tears gathered in his eyes, but I noticed he did not defend himself. He did not blame Madison. He did not say he had been distracted. He simply accepted the weight of his silence. "I kept telling myself it was only a chair," he admitted quietly. "Then Lily asked why you were sitting over there. I could not stop thinking about it after everyone left. She saw something I refused to see." I reached across the table and gently placed my hand over his. Children often recognize respect before adults learn to measure convenience. He nodded slowly. "Madison and I have talked a lot since then. She knows things went too far." I looked at him calmly. "That conversation is between the two of you. My concern is not who is responsible. My concern is whether our family chooses to become better from this point forward." He squeezed my hand gently. "Can you forgive me?" I smiled with a peace I had not felt in years. Forgiveness was never the difficult part, Brian. Trust simply grows more slowly than regret. Before leaving, he stood beside the kitchen door and looked around the little house where he had grown up. "Dad would probably be disappointed in me," he said quietly. I glanced toward Charles's favorite rocking chair beside the window. "He would expect more from you," I answered, "because he always believed you were capable of more." Brian nodded, hugged me much longer than he had the night of the anniversary dinner, and walked toward his truck without another word. I watched from the porch until he disappeared around the corner. Then I returned inside, poured myself another cup of tea, and sat peacefully beneath the afternoon sunlight. I never gave Brian the cashier's check. One day I might, or perhaps I never would. That decision no longer defined our relationship. What mattered was something far more valuable. I had finally reclaimed the one place no one else had the power to assign or take away. It was not a chair in someone else's dining room. It was my own dignity, and this time I intended to keep it.